Hello again, everybody. Melth here with one of my all-time favorite games, Dark Souls 1. I have a very special run planned here. I'll be using an experimental mod that I created and some third-party tools to set the game to its highest possible built-in difficulty and unlock various secret enemies that will almost never be encountered in normal gameplay. Crucially, this will also be a completionist role-playing run, where I don't just skip through zones to get the powerful gear and then use that to crush the game. Speaking of which, if you just want to get straight into the action, I'll put a chapter mark at about 24 minutes where that begins. Until then, I'll be talking about lore and character creation. Throughout this run, besides just showing high-level gameplay, I will also be talking a lot about the game's lore and story, so watch out for spoilers for all three games, as well as hidden game mechanics and game design decisions and lots of things like that. There should be something for everybody. Let's get into character creation, though. One peculiar choice that Dark Souls 1 made is that they jump you right into character creation before viewing the intro cinematic or anything like that. I do think it would have been better to switch the order so we'd have some context about the universe to use when designing our character here and making these choices, but it's a very minor thing. This is probably also a good time to say clearly that I like Dark Souls a lot, but I think it also has both major and minor flaws, and I want to talk about both the good things and the not so good things. So from these videos you can expect a lot of nuanced opinions and some critiques, not just a panegyric for Dark Souls. One neat idea in character creation here is the starting gift, sort of a starting bonus item that you get. Most of these are just consumables, and they're all available somewhere in the game to everybody. The only one that really matters is the Master Key. I'll be picking that one, but I won't be using it to sequence break like most people do. I'll be using it mostly for convenience. There are a couple of areas where it can save you some tedious backtracking. The other interesting one is the Old Witch's Ring, which serves no practical purpose, but unlocks some dialogue that you'd otherwise miss. The ring is obtainable in-game, but not until after that dialogue would already have been missed. One of my goals for this run, though, is to show as much of the game as possible, including lots of the missable dialogue and secrets. I think when the time comes, I'll just use a tool to create a copy of that ring so we can get that dialogue. Anyway, most of the other character creation choices that we make here are pretty much inconsequential, just matters of style. This will be a role-playing run, so I do have a character in mind who will try to be playing appropriately as I go through the game. Some of my decisions later on will be things that make sense from an in-character perspective rather than things that are the most optimal from a gameplay perspective. I think I would say that Dark Souls is a very good game, but fairly weak as a role-playing game in particular. We get very little information about the human parts of this setting, or what life is like for people in this universe. And so it's really not easy to get into character and know what your character would know and how they would make decisions. Most of the countries that exist, we get maybe one trait worth of information about. Even if you dig into all the lore and all the games, most countries are not really well developed. Astora is the country of noble knights who are religious. It seems to be a pretty good place to live, and the people who come from there seem to be generally good people, but we don't really get much more about the country than that. The Dragon Scholars come from Vinheim, a city-state that's dominated by its magic school. So, fine and good. That's a good starting place for the country's lore. But that's almost everything we ultimately get. If you look into every item description and listen to every scrap of dialogue from all three games, we learn that there's a royal family there, but they don't really run the show. We learn that the sorcerers look down on everybody else, and they have a department of conspicuously dressed spies and assassins. In most fantasy settings, that would be the beginning of what we learn about a country. In Dark Souls, that's pretty much it, and Vinheim is more developed than almost anywhere else. Thororland is a country of grumpy and self-righteous clerics presided over by a grumpy and self-righteous god, and Thororland, unlike most of these countries, seems to be gone by the time of Dark Souls 3. That does say interesting things about some of the background politics that are kind of implied among the gods and so forth. So Thororland isn't very interesting, but the disappearance of Thororland is, and I'll talk more about the lore of that later on. We learn almost nothing about Katarina. They like drinking and they have knights who wear onion-shaped helmets. For some reason, the NPCs we meet from Katarina look nothing like this guy if we use mods or third-party tools to remove their hats. They also all have very German names, like Siegmeyer, Sieglind, Siegfried. Karim's one trait in this game is that it's the creepy country of mostly evil people presided over by Count Dracula. Arstor, the Earl of Karim, impales people. He's basically just Vlad the Impaler. Xena we get nothing about, just like the Five-Finger Delta. The Great Swamp's one trait is that the shamanistic pyromancers live there. We'll talk more about pyromancy at a more appropriate time. It's pretty interesting. And then there's generic medieval Japan land in the Far East. One interesting thing is that they seem to be to the Far East of not just Dark Souls 1's setting, but Dark Souls 2's setting too. Even though Dark Souls 2 is probably on another continent, there is no map and no way to place most of these countries in relation to one another. But if you put together a lot of little clues, you can get the impression that Dark Souls 2's continent is probably a separate continent, and it is probably to the north of most of the human countries from Dark Souls 1. And then generic medieval Japanland is somewhere to the far east of both those continents. Probably. As I've said, they just didn't really develop the human setting very much. Anyway, my character will be from Astora. He's not from a knightly family, but he was able to join the clergy. He believes very much in Astora's religion and in their knightly code of honor. Let me talk about the game's class system, by the way. Your class basically only matters for either the early game or PvP optimization. Class just determines your starting stats and your starting gear. But with just a few level ups, every class can raise their stats to whatever they want, and every single spell or item that a class starts off with is available to everybody else, usually pretty early on in the game. So class is mostly going to matter to new people who don't know where to find those things. And if you're optimizing for PvP, you want to pick a class that doesn't have too many points invested in things that you won't be using. But almost every PvP build will use at least a little bit of almost every stat, so it hardly makes a difference. Most pieces of class starting gear are really just not that good, but there are a few things that are genuinely powerful and not available for a while to everybody else. The Cleric, for example, starts off with the Canvas Talisman, which doesn't sound very impressive, but it's actually one of the best talismans in the entire game. And it's not available to anybody else until the game is almost over. So the Cleric, unlike the Sorcerer or Pyromancer, genuinely will be better at its form of magic than the other classes would be. At least for a while. Every class can eventually get one of the other powerful types of talismans. The Pyromancer class is probably a better choice for a new person, though. They can do Pyromancy right away, whereas nobody else will unlock it for about 4 or 5 zones. This is in marked contrast to Sorcery, for example, which is available to everybody right from the start, once you get to the game's hub world. So if you're a new person, don't pick Sorcerer. Sorcery is great, but the Sorcerer class itself is not useful. Knight is the other good beginner choice, I would say. The Knight's armor set is actually one of the best in the entire game, and if you don't know where to find it, you probably won't find it in the world for a long time as a new person. Their stats are pretty beneficial for a new person too, lots of health to keep you alive. You know, for that matter, the Pyromancer also has a pretty good armor set. Not for resisting physical damage, but for resisting status effects. And it's not available to anybody else until the end of the main status effect zone. So for beginners, I would say pick Knight or Pyromancer. Their gear is genuinely useful to start off with. So, I won't bore you with the details of me customizing my character's face, but I will say the game does have a good system for that. There are lots of options and fine-tuned controls. In fact, there are so many that I still don't fully understand what some of them even do. Even Skyrim doesn't have this many customization options. In fact, I think it reminds me more of Oblivion. Oblivion also had a ton of customization options and sliders. I think the character is pretty old, probably. Middle-aged, at least. Has some life experience. Anyway, we'll get into the opening cinematic once I finish designing the character's beautiful, beautiful face, which we'll basically never see in-game. You know, it occurred to me while I was working on this face, that possibly even some people who have gone through character creation don't know just how many options there are. So after clicking on this customization button, you can then click on the subsections, some of which themselves then have further subsections, which then have all of these different sliders. So really, you can play around a lot to get the character face that you want. As long as you don't want to have a beard or mustache, that is. That's not available until Dark Souls 2. Usually come up with a terrible pun name like Survival or Surreptitious or Surup. But this character in this run will get more serious treatment. My character comes from a religious family in Astora, and in Astora they mainly worship Gwyn and his family. The name Gwyn comes from Welsh mythology, and some of his family have Welsh names too. So I think I'm going to name my character Gwydion, after a warrior magician from Welsh mythology. Well, time for the opening cinematic. I think I'll actually show it twice. Once just to soak in the epicness, and a second time to talk about some of the important details and the mistranslations that have confused people for many, many years.
In the age of ancients, the world was unformed, shrouded by fog. A land of grey crags, arch trees, and everlasting dragons. But then there was fire, and with fire came disparity. Heat and cold, life and death, and of course, light and dark. Then from the dark they came and found the souls of lords within the flame. Nito, the first of the day. The Witch of Izalith and her daughters of Chaos. Gwyn, the Lord of Sunlight, and his faithful knights. And the furtive pygmy, so easily forgotten. With the strength of lords, they challenge the dragons. Gwyn's mighty bolts peeled apart their stone skills. The witches weaved great firestorms. Nito unleashed a miasma of death and disease. And Seath, the Scales, betrayed his own, and the dragons were no more. Thus began the Age of Fire. But soon the flames will fade, and only dark will remain. Even now, there are only embers, and man sees not light, but only endless nights. And amongst the living are seen carriers of the accursed dark sign. Yes, indeed. The dark sign brands the undead. And in this land, the undead are corralled and led to the north. Where they are locked away to await the end of the world. This is your fate.
Throughout these videos, I intend to talk a fair amount about Dark Souls' lore and story. A lot of people praise those parts of the game, and at least sometimes with good reason, I would say. The game's lore is also known for being very mysterious and recondite, both in presentation and in terms of the contents. And people argue passionately about their interpretations of some of this stuff. I think it's important to talk about 4 sources of problems which hinder people from understanding the game's lore. The first and most obvious is that this is a video game, and sometimes the game mechanics and design choices that make it a fun video game don't actually reflect the internal logic of the world. One thing that people rightly praise about Dark Souls, especially Dark Souls 1, is that quite often the gameplay mechanics do reflect some element of the story or the world, but not always. So if you're building a theory that depends upon a game mechanic being taken literally as part of the world, it's important to at least keep in the back of your mind the possibility that it is just a game mechanic. Remember Occam's razor, both in and out of the universe. Other things equal, the simplest explanation is best. Often, the simplest explanation of a weird thing that happens is, this is just a game mechanic. Another factor is that sometimes the writers or the game designers simply made a mistake or retconned something. Dark Souls 2 and 3 especially are known to have had a troubled development cycle, and Dark Souls 1 was pretty rushed toward the end. It has several areas that are badly incomplete. Dark Souls 2 also had a different writer and director than the other ones did, so if it seems to contradict the other two on some point, 2 should probably be superseded by the others. Thirdly, there are some pretty major translation flaws. Often, the localizers seem to have prioritized sounding poetic over conveying the meaning. Or they might not have understood or grasped what parts of the original meaning were important, having not seen the rest of the game. Or they were just inconsistent. A lot of Dark Souls lore arguments are based on different interpretations of exact phrasings and connotations of words in English, where the Japanese is often clear and unambiguous. All of these feed into the fourth problem, which is people trumpeting fan theories and spreading them around as if they were canon. A lot of fan ideas have taken off because they make for an emotionally interesting story, even if they have no evidence whatsoever underpinning them. Or there's some evidence but they're far from proven, but then get treated as if they were a certainty and spread around that way. In particular, a lot of theories from the early games obviously needed to be adapted to new evidence that came out with the later ones. But some people who haven't played the later games are spreading the disproven early ideas. I am going to try to avoid contributing to this problem. I'm going to try to stick closely to the evidence or to the simplest interpretations of the evidence. When there are multiple possibilities, which there often are, I will try to say so. And when there is a gap, I am not going to try to make up a story to fill it in. Neither do I have any interest in or patience for the various fan theories that fill in these gaps without good evidence, no matter how pretty or sad they might be.
No matter how tender, how explicit, a lie will remain a lie.
90% of everything we ever learn about the Dark Souls universe comes from this cinematic. It's that important. And we learned that a lot of things were almost unimaginably different from either the real world or most fantasy worlds. Paradoxically, this Age of Ancients is an age before time. And although colloquially, we might want to say those dragons seem like they're alive, they're not alive in the Dark Souls universe sense. Stone in Dark Souls is unliving but eternal, and the dragons and the archtrees were all made of the stone like everything else in the world. On the other hand, sometimes rocks are just rocks. A lot of these sweeping, grand metaphysical concepts in Dark Souls are put aside whenever they would get in the way of a pretty typical medieval fantasy setting. One minor thing I want to note here is that we seem to actually be underground when we're seeing the first flame now. A lot of the time in Dark Souls 1, when you think you're underground, you're actually not. You're really just under the stone canopy of the stone archtrees, which has a whole surface world on top of it. Now, the original Japanese makes two things clear in the upcoming bit that are not clear in the English version. First of all, the creatures that we're seeing were born from the dark. Secondly, they're just animals. We don't have an official name for these things. Some people call them hollows, some call them pygmies, but this can be very confusing either way. I myself prefer to just call them the proto-humanoids to avoid confusion. Anyway, the important thing is that all of these beings we're about to hear about started off exactly the same before they found the souls. As a minor thing, you might have wondered like I did if Nito is the first as in the earliest or the greatest. It's definitely the earliest. He's an intriguing character, but he gets basically no lore or development compared to the others for some reason. Nito is also the first instance we see of something else that confuses people about Dark Souls. He's a giant skeleton thing, and so colloquially we might want to call him undead. But in Dark Souls, he's emphatically not undead. Skeletons and ghosts and whatnot are not to be called undead in this universe. One thing here that I've never found satisfactorily explained is that the soul the pygmy finds here looks just like the souls the others found, bright and fiery. But he's supposed to have found the unique Dark Soul. We never do get a motive for this war. The default assumption people make is that it was a power grab by the Four Lords, and maybe that's true, but we don't get any information about that. It's the most important event in Souls World's history, and yet we don't know why it was done. Incidentally, a lot of dragons in this setting breathe fire like traditional fantasy dragons, even though dragons predate fire as a whole. I do note that the dragons in this cutscene don't breathe fire, and it's clear that the dragons began giving birth to increasingly weird mutant descendants, some of which couldn't even be called dragons anymore. Some of them, including some who breathe fire, are clearly and unambiguously referred to as archdragons, though. That bit about the dragons being no more is a bad translation. The Japanese only says the dragons were defeated, which makes sense because we find multiple dragons in every single game, even excluding the ones that are just wyverns. Which reminds me, I've seen people argue at great length about what a wyvern versus a drake is in this universe. The answer is there is no difference, it's the same word being translated inconsistently. Some people, by the way, seem to think that there is going to be a cycle of Ages of Fire, Ages of Dark, Ages of Ancients. Some of what we see in Dark Souls 3 does suggest that there might be cyclical Ages of Fire and Dark. But I've never seen anything credibly suggesting there could be return to the Age of Ancients. That would require an end to the existence of disparity.
Even now, there are only embers.
Another thing people debate is how literally to take it that there are now only endless nights. It's certainly not night at the Undead Asylum, which is outside of Lordran, and we know from the Delta Farmer description that agriculture is still going on. At most, I could be persuaded that there is a sunless twilight.
Carriers of the
Minor translation ambiguity here: no living people have the dark sign. What we just saw there is that there's a dark splotch or hole in the flesh of a dead person, and then flames began to spread into a ring around the outside of it. The dark sign is the key to a lot of the biggest mysteries of the Dark Souls setting. Until Dark Souls 3, we got basically no more information about it. But then Dark Souls 3 and its final DLC brought us some, I would say, actually satisfying answers. At the time of Dark Souls 1 at least, though, the dark sign was not understood by either the players or by the people in the universe. All the people in universe know is that the undead eventually turn into mindless hollows that attack anything nearby to take souls, and that killing them doesn't accomplish anything for very long. So it makes sense to lock them away instead.
undead are corralled.
You might
in
wonder
their
what
to the
this land is that the Undead Asylum is far to the north of. We don't have any kind of map of the human realms. People from Astora seem to know about the place, so maybe it's north of Astora, but that is the flimsiest scrap of evidence. It's not entirely clear how many of the dead become undead. They do seem to become numerous enough if they get out of control to destroy entire kingdoms.
This
So it's no wonder they were talking about the end of the world there. People correctly view this as an apocalyptic threat. Now, this sequence where Oscar throws the key into her cell on a body is one of the things that confuses a lot of people. Sometimes the mystery or ambiguity in Dark Souls is very artificial feeling. If Oscar so much as said a word or made a gesture here, there wouldn't be a mystery to what was going on most likely. The simplest explanation here is that he's trying to free undead from the asylum, at least some of them. That seems to fit his later dialogue and some key descriptions later on. But in that case, wouldn't it have made more sense to throw us the key, not a corpse that has the key? Or, better yet, just go through cell by cell with the keys, freeing the lucid-looking undead. Some people suggest that it was an accident, and he didn't mean to knock in the key. But he sure doesn't look frustrated or disappointed, and that would be an unsatisfying freak coincidence anyway. I've also heard it proposed that the corpse is supposed to cover for our escape, like people will think that that corpse is us still in the cell. But there are multiple levels in which that doesn't make sense in-universe. And none of his other actions seem stealthy or furtive. Lastly, and perhaps least satisfyingly, it might just be a game mechanic that they shrugged and said, well, there may be no answers about it. In this game, almost always, items are found on corpses. That's the main way that the physics system handles item placements and where you retrieve items from. In any case, I bet by now it's abundantly clear from what I've been talking about that my favorite parts of the game's stories are the ones where we have to work for the answers but answers exist. And my least favorite parts are the ones where there are no answers to find behind character motivations and actions. Fortunately, that's pretty rare. So, let me talk about what will make this challenge run so challenging. The most important thing, actually, is that it's going to be a role-playing run in which I don't sequence break. I've seen lots of supposed challenge runs, where people start themselves off with ultra weapons, or just skip past every enemy to grab an endgame thing and then just pulverize the game with that. None of that for me. I'm going to play each area in what seems at least like a plausible intended order for them, and complete each zone, rather than move on ahead to grab good gear and come back to fight a boss. Speaking of role-playing and story-related things, let's take a look around this cell. Environmental details are one of the key things that we use to decipher what happens in Dark Souls. So we see here that this prison for undead includes fairly conventional, filthy prison accommodations. In this universe, the undead seem to have pretty much normal bodily functions. They eat and drink, they're vulnerable to things like poison and disease, they suffer pain. Depending on how you interpret some stuff in Dark Souls 3, they might even be able to reproduce. Not sure. All of which is to say that the undead are really not that different from the living in most respects. These orange things on the ground are developer messages telling us the basic controls and things like that. We won't find many of them outside of the initial zone. So coming up ahead here we have our first enemy, a basic, lightly armed hollow. We'll fight a lot more heavily armed hollows later on. Now if I was playing on normal difficulty, I would have killed this guy easily in about 3 or 4 hits. But the next part of my challenge run is that I'm playing on New Game plus 6 difficulty, the maximum. When you beat the game, you start back at your cell again on what is called New Game Plus. You keep all your powerful gear and spells, but the enemies are all powered up to be a challenge for you. And that can happen up to 6 times, getting harder and harder. But I'm going to face that maximum difficulty with just a fresh start character who has nothing. So at this point, enemies are about 5 to 10 times sturdier than they normally would be and do a lot more damage to me too. Anything will basically 1 or 2 hit kill me. Don't worry though, not every single fight will be as tedious and time consuming as it can be in, say, Skyrim Legendary. Because I have found that if I get creative and strategic, and use unusual weapons and tools that don't see much play in normal mode, I can defeat these enemies fairly efficiently, although they remain extremely deadly on offense against me. Anyway, notice that giant monstrous demon walking around past those bars there. You can miss him if you just stroll through casually, paying attention to only what's in front of you. We'll meet and fight another similar demon soon, but there are actually two of them. And this little scene here is one of our few clues that this guy exists, and has seemingly been pulverizing hollows on these bars. Now, a lot of environments in Dark Souls tell interesting stories, and are clearly put together with a lot of thought and care. The Undead Asylum is kind of a mixed bag, though. For example, on one hand, the place seems to be basically abandoned, with no guards here to even keep the hollows in their cells. But there are torches burning everywhere for the benefit of whom exactly? That's obviously not very important. What bothers me a little bit more, I think, about the torches is just that the game's biggest theme and motif is this idea that the fire is inevitably going out. But then the game is just full of torches and other fires that burn forever and ever, which kind of undercuts their theme there. Switching back to game talk, you might have noticed that each hollow I kill drops 125 souls, which are shown in the bottom right counter. If I was not playing on New Game Plus 6, they would drop fewer souls. Now, infinite souls are already available no matter what, so this basically just saves time. It doesn't make things easier per se. I'm also going to impose a level cap on myself of 125, the traditional PvP level. I might even show you some PvP if they turn the servers back on at some point. Regardless, the extra souls will help me show you a wider variety of the game's unusual items and equipment. Anyway, back to the setting. Here we reach our first bonfire, which are the game's checkpoints. They serve kind of a lore role, but they're mainly a gameplay element. You can see that it consists of a sword stuck into a smoldering pile of bones. I think I'll save talking about the lore of that for later on. There's already a lot of stuff to discuss. Looking around this place, you can get the impression that it might have been built as a church originally and then later repurposed into a prison. Not necessarily, but it would make some sense with the architecture, and also with how in this setting the main religion that we hear about in this game helps persecute the undead. On the other hand, there aren't that many religious symbols here, so maybe not. I did notice these ugly dog statues, but that's about it, and I can't think of anywhere else in the game that those recur that I can make a connection to. Nor can I think of any kind of lore of symbolism of dogs in this universe. Anyway, if you're observant and look through that hole in the wall, you can see that there's a giant demon waiting up there on the roof. The game really does often reward observant players, with lore, with hidden items, or with forewarnings of danger, which is great. More games should do that. Now, this is our first boss. We can technically fight him now, but we're really not supposed to and shouldn't try to. It's not that hard when you know his attack pattern, it's just tedious and miserable without a good weapon. I think it would take me over 2 solid hours of chipping at him. I think the designers probably intended you to just get killed by this guy to teach you about how death works in this game with your checkpoint safely right nearby. But anyway, what you do to progress is just run into this door which is hidden on the left. Conveniently, he doesn't just break through that flimsy door and come after you. And we get to our next checkpoint bonfire, so we don't need to worry about him for a while. I might add, by the way, that if you do kill the Asylum Demon early, you do get a special reward, but it's worthless. It's a giant hammer that you can't wield without massive investment in your strength stat, and even then it's not very good, and there are other ways to obtain it early game anyway. This next hallway here teaches us about the importance of shields, blocking, and taking cover. Pretty effective tutorial stuff. Like this one, most items that we find in the game will come from corpses on the ground for some reason. One common and interesting theory, by the way, which is backed up by some in-game stuff we see, as well as with some stuff that the director said, is that these corpses, or at least some of them, are actually hollows which have lost even the will to keep moving. Anyway, whatever class you are determines what shield you get from that corpse. As a cleric, we get the East-West shield, which is one of the worst shields in the game. One interesting source of clues about the game world, by the way, are the heraldic designs of some of these shields. The East-West shield has the double-headed eagle symbol, which in the real world was used by the Byzantine Empire and the Holy Roman Empire, and I think the Russian Empire at some points. No idea what it means in the Dark Souls universe, though. Sometimes the design on the shield is just there to look pretty. Especially because some of them were apparently created by an art contest that From Software did where people could just submit shield designs. Which is pretty cool, I guess. Anyway, we get our first weapon now, which because we're a cleric is the mace. Besides making me do a lot more damage, you can see it also has a quite different moveset. Notice that I have a staggering animation if I just whiff an attack like that. That won't happen when I hit an enemy. It's a unique detriment of hammers and a few other types of weapons. Oh, this that I'm doing here, by the way, is a backstab. A special move you can do only against certain enemies. It deals a lot of damage and makes you invincible during the duration, so that's very useful. The guards, by the way, get an F- for leaving that mace lying around to be picked up. Almost every hollow in this place is armed. Speaking of which, even though my weapon is now a lot better, this hollow actually takes a lot of hits to kill anyway because he got a big upgrade. Every hollow from this point on is a lot stronger than the previous ones because now we have a weapon and they're scaled appropriately. Through this foggy door, you'll see the next part of this challenge run appear. I made a mod to turn on certain enemies that are very rarely seen. Some of them, especially the Gravelord phantoms encountered later on, will be very interesting and deadly to deal with. This guy is harmless though, just kind of a runaway item bag will try to escape from us and disappear. This kind of enemy is called a good vagrant. Vagrants in general are almost never seen. In fact, most players don't even know that they exist. A person can go their entire Dark Souls playing life without ever seeing a single one of them. Killing this one is tricky. I need to stun lock it so it doesn't just disappear. To do that, I need to time my attacks. I also need to rest between attacks to recover my stamina, which is that green bar in the top left that lets me attack, among other things. And I also need to avoid having my hammer hit the wall, which would stun me, and let it get away. I'd like to make note of one other thing, by the way, which is that there's an important item up that nearby staircase. But I can't get it because like 2 stairs are broken. One of the silliest things about Dark Souls is how often your path is blocked by utterly trivial obstacles like that. It's not even consistent. Sometimes you can walk up and down broken stairs no problem. Anyway, it's kind of a clue that you can return to this area later on from another direction. Relatedly, you can see that we've gotten back to the bonfire that we were at before, but now we're on a level above it. Dark Souls' environments include a lot of satisfying and fun 3D mazes like this, where everything fits together somewhat logically. This giant metal ball trap that I just dodged there is basically a copy and paste from Demon's Souls, where it made a lot more sense, to be honest. Somehow, a supposedly almost mindless hollow got a giant iron ball and set a trap just in case a non-hollow walked by. It doesn't make any sense. Anyway, it opened a path into this room where we can find Oscar, who dropped the key down to us before. You can see that the only door to this room is blocked by rubble, so how did he get in? Once again, the environment kind of tells the story, which is pretty cool. He was up on the roof. The demon was up on the roof. He got smashed through that hole in the roof by the demon. That doesn't explain, of course, why there's a torch burning in this room that has no entrance, but whatever.
Thank goodness.
So here's kind of our first clue of what these hollows are that we've been dealing with. They're undead that have lost their sanity in some way. The game is never really on the nose with their explanations of things like that, which is interesting, if occasionally frustrating. A lot of dialogue choices in Dark Souls are basically fake choices and you get more or less the same result, but let's play along with them here. As part of my role-playing run, by the way, I'll be trying to do all the NPC stories, all the way through to the end for them, and seeing every scrap of optional or hidden dialogue if I can. I always kind of dislike this, because this sounds nothing like an old family saying. It's clearly more some kind of prophecy or something like that.
When thou ringest the bell of awakening, the fate of the undead thou shalt know. Well, now you know, and I can die with hope in my heart. Oh, one more thing. Here, take this. An Estus flask. An undead favorite.
The Estus flask is basically a rechargeable healing potion. It's a pretty cool mechanic, at least in theory.
Now I must bid farewell. I would hate to harm you after death.
In universe, we could probably just, take his weapons so he couldn't harm us after death, but we can't do that in-game for whatever reason. The game is wildly and frustratingly inconsistent about when enemies drop their weapons and armor when they die and when they don't. Now, we never really get an explicit explanation of what actually makes undead go hollow, versus when they can just die and revive without going hollow. Sometimes it seems to be if you have no purpose you go hollow. Sometimes it's if you give in to despair, but he says he has hope, so it can't be that for him. Sometimes just a degenerative process sped along by dying. Regardless, he dies, we get his souls, and if we return here later on, we can actually fight him as a hollow. Now, if we die, we respawn at their most recent bonfire. Based on that and the dark side description, a lot of people think the undead really revive at bonfires in-universe. I'm not certain about that though. I think that passage from the dark side description is clearly describing game mechanics. And the game behavior of literally everybody else contradicts ours. Various cutscenes and item descriptions and environmental things suggest the undead are more or less rising again where they fell to be killed again and again in some places. Heck, even we don't always revive at bonfires. And all these major repeated story and setting elements of undead being locked away make no sense if they can just kill themselves to respawn to the bonfire elsewhere. So I'm not sure. By the way, that special move that I did there to that hollow is called a parry and riposte. It's the game's trickiest and riskiest but most rewarding maneuver. If your timing is good, you get to deal massive damage. If your timing is bad, you get wrecked. Anyway, here I must proceed with caution, because I'm approaching the game's first multi-enemy ambush. Dark Souls 1 usually is a game of fighting one powerful enemy at a time. It's rare to be forced to fight multiple ones at once, because it's quite dangerous and difficult in this system. the game controls don't really support it as well as they would in some other action RPGs. One thing people complained about a lot with Dark Souls 2 is that it relied very heavily on having you fight swarms of guys to create difficulty. And this was doable, but the controls didn't really make it as fun or smooth as would be in most other action RPGs. By the way, the item that I picked up there lets me cast my cleric spells, but all I have right now is a heal, which I don't need, so you won't see me use that yet. Anyway, it's best to fight those enemies one at a time, especially because with my mod, there'll be one there called an Evil Vagrant, which is really deadly. Look at that beautiful scenery there, by the way, just looking over this broken down wall. I'd like to point out once again that in-universe, it would make sense to just kind of lower ourselves down off that wall to make our escape from here. But instead, because it's Dark Souls, we can't go down that, so we have to instead fight a giant demon. One of the few things I dislike about this game is how a lot of the boss fights just kind of feel like, in-universe, one or both parties had no reason to fight. Anyway, you've seen me use a couple more parries and ripostes and backstabs here. If you've mastered the timing and positioning of them, those are the quickest ways to dispatch most enemies. In fact, if it wasn't New Game Plus 6, the damage would be massive overkill. One neat mechanic in this game that kind of encourages you and rewards you for doing those maneuvers is that if you overkill the enemy by enough, you get bonus souls from them. Why isn't this Vagrant aggroing to me? Usually they're pretty aggressive. This kind of Vagrant has an insanely deadly projectile attack. Even if you're not on New Game Plus 6, that attack will just instant kill almost anybody, through almost any kind of armor. But it's really easy to block with shields for some reason, at least if you have a good shield. Anyway, I'll lead him to this more open area to fight him, so I don't need to fight him while I'm being shot at with arrows at the same time. The melee attacks in these red Vagrants would instant kill me too, but they're pretty easy to avoid by just stun locking the guys, as long as I circle them so they can't get me in front and do a quick swing. Vagrants can't be backstabbed or parried and riposted, by the way. Pretty much only human enemies can be, and not even all of those. Anyway, as long as I number 1 manage my stamina, and number 2 don't get this guy close to a wall where my weapon might rebound and stun me for a little bit, I think I can manage him pretty easily. So let me talk about what creates Vagrants and why they're almost never seen. First of all, you have to be online to find them, and servers have been down for 5 months now, so good luck with that. Second of all, to find the good Vagrants, something very rare has to happen, which is that somebody has to willingly abandon an item in a game where there's no reason to ever abandon an item. But not just one person. If one person abandons an item online, it might become a randomized other item in somebody else's world. If that person also for no reason leaves the item untouched, and a total of 10 people do the same thing, then it becomes a Vagrant in somebody's world. Obviously, the odds of that happening are vanishingly small, because when do video game players ever willingly abandon an item with no reason? And that tiny probability has to get raised to the 10th power, so it basically never happens. A cool and unique, but not terribly well thought through multiplayer aspect, I would say. Not surprised it was dropped from the rest of the series. Evil Vagrants spawn in a little bit more easily, but even they are still pretty rare. A person has to die and fail to reclaim at least 5 humanity, which is quite a lot. And they have to do that online. So it happens more commonly with good Vagrants, but it's still really rare. Anyway, Vagrants have certain predefined spawn points that they can appear from if those rare circumstances happen, and my mod just makes them always spawn in. Anyway, I'd like to reiterate that once I get past this first zone, most fights won't be as slow as they have been in this video. I'll be able to get ways to mitigate some enemies' defenses. It won't be the same thing for every enemy, I'll have to get creative, but I can, if I am creative, get through most enemies faster than this. To boil down what this run is, I'm essentially just doing the game's highest possible difficulty. I'm not adding new things to the game, I'm just unlocking all of the built-in challenges. This time, by the way, that fog door is a boss room door. Sometimes fog doors are just kind of ways for the game to load in areas without you noticing, but this time it actually represents this is the boss room. They're another game element that was just kind of copied over from Demon Souls, and made more sense in Demon Souls than they do here, but oh well. Anyway, here we meet a Hollow Soldier, a much more powerful kind of basic Hollow enemy. A lot sturdier, a lot more deadly, and they have more dangerous overall sword techniques. This guy, by the way, might be a guard who went Hollow. That would explain why he is heavily armed, and why he is standing by a door that we can't get through until we have a key later on. It is also a recurring motif in this series of having the guards and jailers and hunters of undead become undead and then hollow themselves. There's no reason, by the way, for me to actually fight this guy. He's purely optional on a side path that I can't actually go down right now. But as part of my completionist restriction for this run, I won't be skipping enemies. At least not until I've killed them a couple of times and shown that I can do it easily. I'll go to every part of every zone, collect all the items, and kill all the enemies. Okay, so before we go through the boss story, they tell us about plunging attacks. A very situational kind of attack we can sometimes do. Basically, if you fall off an object on somebody, you can do an attack on the way down for massive damage. and not take fall damage. Sometimes. The whole thing is very buggy, to be honest. It's a cool idea, but it's often pretty buggy. One trick is if instead of just falling off, you do a jumping attack like this, you can do some extra damage that way. One cool thing, by the way, you can't just loiter in his boss room after going through that boss door on that balcony. He'll jump up and hit you with a special attack eventually. Oh, there's that bug I was talking about. I fell right through him taking fall damage, and he didn't take the massive damage. Well, as you saw there, rolling makes you invincible. I rolled right through his hammer. The game doesn't tell you that. It's really important information, but they don't tell you it. It's completely counterintuitive and silly that rolling would make you pass through weapons without harm and just be invincible, but that's the way it works. Now, once you know about it, it works great. It's a cool system, it rewards good timing, it's fun. But they don't tell you about it, and it doesn't really make any sense. My first time playing, I tried to actually avoid every single attack, basically. Just sprint everywhere, or multi-roll to get out of the way. Don't need to do any of that. Just roll right through every single attack. Roll right into the weapon on purpose, and you'll be fine. Anyway, with this boss, I want to stay behind him. He has almost no attacks that can hit me when I'm back there. But there are still some hazards to watch out for when playing on New Game Plus 6 difficulty, at least. For one thing, you can often get caught on his tail if you're not careful, which can then push you out of position and leave you to get hit by his hammer when you thought you were safe. Another problem is that he often backs himself up when making his attacks. Sooner or later, if the fight goes on long enough, he's likely to back himself up against a wall. And if he's up against a wall, you can't circle him anymore, which leaves you in a danger zone, or possibly getting stuck and hit by his hammer and instant kills. But one thing I noticed is if he uses his fly up into the air attack, he'll then turn to face you. Which means you can control what direction his back is to if you run around him while he's flying up into the air. So if you keep putting his back to the middle of the room, you can then often use that to move him away from the walls and toward the center, if you kind of manipulate the boss's AI that way. It's tricky and it's hard to pull it off successfully all the time, but it helps a lot at the very least. You know, it's a good thing that all those shards of rock he kicks up don't actually hurt me. Inconsistent though, because there's another demon later on whose smaller shards of rock will hurt you. Speaking of inconsistencies, notice how this giant, heavy, house-sized guy is constantly flying up into the air and landing on this stone floor, or smashing with his giant hammer again and again and again. Evidently the floor is pretty sturdy. It sure would be strange if later on when we came back here that floor collapsed under us just walking over it, and only under us, not under anybody else walking over it. Imagine how improbable it would be that this guy's hammer would weaken the floor just enough that later on, but not now, a mere human walking over it would collapse it, but not while he's smashing it. If you fall into that pit later on, you end up right into a boss fight immediately with a boss who can easily instant kill you, so it's pretty nasty. Not a problem once you know about it, but it's kind of an unpleasant and not terribly fair first-time player gotcha moment. I think, by the way, that I've probably proven my point that you can beat this guy with your initial dagger weapon if you need to. It's just really, really slow and time-consuming and not much fun. But if you can just consistently dodge like I'm doing, you'll chip him down eventually. It just takes like 2 hours on New Game Plus 6. This time I can't circle around him enough to get him away from where I want him to go. Well, you might also notice another technique that I'm using is I don't always lock on. Lock on is kind of a double-edged sword because it slows you down a lot and also makes it so that your camera can go screwy depending on how the enemy moves. Sometimes it's great, sometimes it can get you killed, so just you kind of learn with practice and experience when it's good to lock on and when it's not good to lock on. Oh, one other neat thing. You probably noticed by now that he's able to destroy these pillars around the room, but I am not able to do so. That seldom matters, it's just kind of cool. Well, while I try to manipulate him back away from the wall again, let me talk maybe about some of the lore surrounding him. There's not that much. Demons in general started off as either humans or some kind of other humanoid species like the Witch of Izalith species that got mutated into monsters, usually against their will. They seem to be a little bit dumber than people, but they're not just animals either. They can learn magic and do things like that, and can obviously have some kind of rudimentary civilization at the very least. A war was fought against them for somewhat unclear reasons. A lot of them were killed or contained, but some of them were able to leave the city that they originated from. And I mean, basically from there, they're just individuals that can do what they want. Some of them just seemed to rampage around, some became crime bosses basically, and some voluntarily seemingly joined the services of either the gods or the humans. And some were forced into service, seemingly. We don't really know the motive of this one or the one in the basement. I think it makes the most sense to assume that they're here voluntarily because nothing's stopping them from escaping if they wanted to. Hollows are certainly also a threat and a nuisance to demons, so no reason they wouldn't necessarily work with humans to contain them. But at the end of the day, we just don't have much on them. The one in the basement is a wizard, but we get nothing else on him. He's just kind of a copy-paste. As for the logistics of what in the world they eat up here in this remote location, Don't really know. There are an awful lot of jars in this room for whatever reason. I don't think anything's in them. I don't think there's any indication of them having ever contained anything, but I don't know. Maybe we're supposed to think that they were demon chow or something? I'm just reaching here, just trying to come up with something. At the end of the day, we really just don't know much about this guy. It's the main point that I'm making here. He's a lesser demon. The demons sometimes work with the gods or the humans. He's probably doing that here. Maybe they're paying him. Maybe he's supposed to be unwilling but just not escaping for some reason. Who knows? As a boss on New Game, he's definitely a tutorial boss. He's really quite flimsy. You can just button mash him down, in fact. Considering his hugeness, he's really not anywhere near as tough as he should be. Likewise, his damage is disproportionately small for his massive, massive size. Like, this guy's the size of a house, swinging weapon the size of a car. But he does, depending on your armor, maybe like 3 times the damage that the basic emaciated hollows wielding blunt, broken knives with clumsy attacks do. For game balance, that's good, which is what really matters, but it is just weird in universe how little damage he does for his massive size. And that's kind of a pattern throughout this game, that damage is not really always proportionate to what it looks like it ought to be. Notice, by the way, you can still hear the footsteps of the demon in the basement. A nice touch to remind you that he's still down there if you didn't pay attention the first time. Anyway, the first boss beaten, and bosses don't respawn when you use bonfires, unlike normal enemies. And we get to the outside that we could have just dropped down to from that balcony earlier. Good job, they say. Go straight ahead, they say. If you take that advice, you'll miss something interesting over here. You can see there's a cemetery here, by the way. I tend to take that as support for my idea that this is probably a church originally then rebuilt into an asylum for the undead, but it's also possible that these are the headstones of, guards who died here or something like that. Who knows? Over here, there's a little bird's nest with one of the game's most bizarre mechanics about to be introduced. This unseen crow... Why aren't they talking? Or why isn't it talking? Well, the unseen crow here tells you to give him, or her, or whatever, soft or warm things. And if you drop certain items there, you get certain other items in exchange for them. But the items that you can drop include a lot of things that are neither soft nor warm, so that clue is less than worthless. You kind of just have to drop every single thing in the game once to see what you get. Or memorize the list.
Give me soft.
Humanity, to be fair, might actually be warm and soft, based on some other descriptions that we get in other places. So I will accept this one as one that does kind of fit the clue they gave, grudgingly. But you give them a lot of things that are obviously going to be cold or hard or both. The system is also kind of clunky that you need to drop an item one at a time, then exit out and then reload the area. Just kind of a little time consuming. Anyway, there may be kind of a lore connection between what I gave them with the humanity and what I get in exchange. So these rings of sacrifice are one-time use rings, whereas most rings are permanent. Basically, if you die, you don't suffer the normal consequences while you're wearing them. The ring is sacrificed instead. In the case of the rare ring, you also don't suffer the effects of curses if you die to a curse. Now, they're created in some kind of sacrificial rite, and I think it was specifically a human sacrifice. A lot of things associated with Velka, or that resist curses in particular, are very definitely things that involve humans being sacrificed to just, suffer the consequences of some kind of bad thing instead of you. Curses can't be broken in this setting, we're told, they can only be redirected to another person, or, the remnants of another person. So, possibly the humanity of a person is in each of these rings, to suffer consequences instead of us. Just like with the cursed skull perching stones we get later on. Anyway, you can see that we're up in a mountain range here, which looks both very isolated and therefore kind of appropriate, but also, notably, it's not on top of arch trees here. We're just up in, what seem to be regular old mountains. This is unlike Lordran, which is built up on the tops of arch trees. Anyway, cool cinematic.
That one day an undead shall be chosen.
The goddess Velka, by the way, is associated with crows, and so this giant crow might have some relation to her, but we have nothing else about it, really. So that's grasping at straws.
To the land of the ancient lords. Lordran.
So, Lordran seems to be the area that we saw in the initial cinematic, and it's the main setting of the game here. The Undead Asylum is elsewhere, somewhere in the realms of humanity. I love the scenery here and this beautiful sunset over this majestic giant castle city. Notice that aqueduct there. Lots of things to look at, but the aqueduct is one of the ones that actually matters. You might also mistakenly think that it's a bridge rather than an aqueduct, but it's important to know that it is an aqueduct because that's basically your only clue about where to go later on. But we'll get to that next time when I start the game proper. Until then, I could say have a great day, everyone, But Dark Souls does have a few very memorable farewell lines characters give, like "Don't you dare go hollow" or "Be one with the sunlight forevermore." Could use one of those instead, maybe. If it was Dark Souls 2, I would of course have to say, "Feeble cursed one, do you really think you can manage the glories that are my videos?"